What's up everyone, and welcome to another OmniFocus Fitness video. Today we will be discussing the subject of satiety. How does satiety occur? It is actually far more complex than one might imagine. And along those lines, of course, we're also going to offer a solution on how to increase, or for certain people, like myself, decrease satiety. So, without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. Let's go! Okay, as usual, first things first, what is satiety? Satiety is, in the most basic definition, just the feeling of fullness or satisfaction from consuming food. So if you are feeling full after consuming a meal, then you are satiated. I think I'm pronouncing that right. If not, fuck it. Who cares? But that is the feeling of fullness, basically. So now we understand what satiety is. We will move on to figuring out how exactly it occurs. Okay, so we understand what satiety is. Now we're trying to figure out as far as how it occurs. And I did mention in the introduction that it is far more complex than one would imagine. And it is so complex that I will be breaking it down based on anatomical positions of the body. So the first position is the mouth. So when food first enters, when we're eating food, okay, so you go from an unsatiated state, which if I'm pronouncing this wrong the whole video, you're gonna have to forgive me because I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly, but you understand what I'm saying. So if you're in an unsatiated, so you're not full of food, you're not satisfied, and you consume food, then that process of consuming food, just putting it in your mouth, and just from that one point alone can already start the feelings of satiation. And secondly, moving on down the esophagus to the stomach. In the stomach, there are actually three main ways that we get feedback as far as if we are satisfied, satiated. So one of those is gastric distension. So gastric meaning the stomach, distension meaning kind of a stretching. So if as you're consuming food, of course, it's going to have to go in a particular area, and the stomach only has a certain amount of volume that it can consume, of course. So as you consume food, your stomach is eventually going to fill up. It's really quite basic. As your stomach fills up, then you feel more satiated. Another aspect of the stomach feedback system are called chemoreceptors. So chemoreceptors, in their most basic sense, are just receptors that take chemical processes and convert them to a nerve impulse. So they're able to then send signals up to particular parts of the body. So specifically, we're going to be talking about the brain, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But chemoreceptors are another feedback system that our body uses along with gastric distension to relay the message of, are we full, are we satisfied, or are we not? And finally, while gastric distension is obviously extremely important as far as the amount of food that we consume, on the back end, of course, there's also gastric emptying. Right? So, and just as the name implies, you're emptying the stomach. So the stomach is eventually going to drop what's called chyme down, and I may be mispronouncing that as well, but that's correct, chyme. So chyme goes through the stomach and eventually ends up in the small intestine. So that gastric emptying will also obviously have a pretty profound impact, because the faster the gastric emptying, the less satiated you will feel, and the slower, obviously, and conversely, the slower, the more satiated you will feel. Pretty basic, but it is important. Okay, so now we've moved out of the stomach, and let's go ahead and move into the intestines. So the intestines have a particular feedback system as well. I'm not going to go too much into detail with each feedback system, but in this particular one, we're talking about hormones. So specifically, there are two hormones, and there are of course many more, but two specific hormones that play a pretty big influence on how the body reacts, or how the brain realizes how satisfied the actual body is as far as food consumption is concerned. So those two hormones are Glucagon-like peptide and Cholecystokinin. May have pronounced that wrong too. You could probably see a theme by now, but I'll write it up somewhere so you can actually see how it's spelled out. Again, I might have butchered it again, but those two hormones are definitely very important when it comes to chyme actually entering the intestinal area. So small intestine, large intestine, etc., etc., and that actually has a profound impact on the rest of the body. So right now we've already discussed several different feedback systems, and there are more to come on just figuring out if your stomach is, and it's kind of tricky because really satiety is broken up into two different parts. Most people don't talk about it, but there's gastric satiety and then there's also intestinal satiety, and they both play off of one another, and they both have profound impacts, especially if we're talking about more pathological issues like obesity, for example. But that's not the topic of this video. Most likely I'll end up discussing it in further videos. But for now, just know that there are several different feedback mechanisms, and we've already talked about a few of them. So things are already getting pretty complex. But let's move on from the intestines. So another area of feedback is the liver. Surprisingly, well, maybe not so surprisingly, but apparently your blood glucose levels, while they are pretty strictly maintained within a certain range, if you are healthy, of course, the release of insulin actually does have an impact on your satiety. So if you are, for example, in a hypoglycemic state, that can actually have an impact. And it kind of makes sense. I mean, if you're in a hypoglycemic state, your body is fighting really hard to try and bring your blood glucose levels up. And I would assume that the same would also be true of a hyperglycemic state. And finally, the last point of feedback, or really where everything merges together. So, you know, you're talking about the intestines, talking about the gastric area, the mouth, the actual ingestion of food, we're talking about the liver. All these feedback mechanisms lead to a particular area of the body, and it seems pretty self-explanatory that the brain plays a massive role on really anything that's related to the body, but a specific area of the brain called the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus regulates a lot of different things, but it does also regulate hunger, when we eat and when we shouldn't eat. And that can get pretty complex within itself, but if we are to again talk about a feedback mechanism that has a profound impact on the hypothalamus, we're talking about two specific hormones. And those two specific hormones, I think, were discovered in the late, maybe mid to late 1990s. One of them is called leptin, and the other one is called ghrelin. So ghrelin has a more specific acute effect on the hypothalamus, while leptin has more of a chronic impact on the hypothalamus. But both of those have an overwhelming power on the brain's ability to decide if a person is hungry or not hungry. And this is specifically, I mean, you can absolutely see this in pathological cases, which again, I keep referring to. So most likely I'm going to end up writing something about this and making a video about this. But just know that leptin and ghrelin are two hormones, very powerful hormones, that actually play a pretty significant role in how you feel, if you feel satiated or if you feel unsatiated. But not only that, even in a physiological state, so if you are physiologically full, you have a stomach distension, your stomach is full with volume of foods, you're getting feedback from other hormones, you're getting feedback from these chemoreceptors, that leptin is powerful enough and ghrelin are powerful enough to actually kind of overrule other physiological conditions. They are that powerful. Now, I'm not saying that they're the end-all be-all by any means. Those other feedback mechanisms play a huge role, and especially if you're in a healthy state, most likely this isn't really the case. You don't really have to worry about leptin or ghrelin somehow screwing up your feeling of fullness, but it is still important to mention, and I think it's really interesting as well, that these two hormones can have such a profound impact on if you feel, and especially to think that it's something that's affecting your brain about your stomach and your intestines. Seems kind of strange, but that is the case. So those are the feedback mechanisms, and as you can see, there are many of them. There are probably other feedback mechanisms that I have not mentioned, but for the time being, just know that those several feedback mechanisms based on the anatomical position, there are a lot of them. So things are a little more complex than normal. However, we will now discuss how we can increase or decrease satiety. Let's do it. Okay, so what are some practices to either increase, if you're, for example, dieting, you probably want to increase your satiety, and if you're trying to gain weight, most likely you're trying to decrease your satiety. Or some you fall somewhere in between, but you'd like to do one or the other. Well, there are a few methods by which you can actually kind of play along with your physiological condition and manipulate it so that you feel fuller longer or earlier. So one of those things is the macronutrients that you eat. So hopefully you know that macronutrients make up the calories in all foods. So if we focus on the three main macronutrients, there's one specifically, and I'm sure that this probably isn't news to you, but there's one specifically that increases satiety remarkably, so significantly over the other macronutrients, and that one is protein. Pretty simple. Eating protein or eating more protein actually leads to greater satiety. Not only that, if you were to add protein with another macronutrient, be it fat, be it carbohydrates, you would actually see an almost the same amount of satiety. Not quite, but as a good runner-up, having protein with, carbohydrates or fats would actually lead to greater satiety. But protein for sure is the macronutrient. So eat more protein. Okay, so the next one is consumption quality. Consumption quality and speed, actually, to be more precise. So the slower that you eat food, the better impact on satiety. And along with that, the more that you chew food, so the more mastication that that occurs, the better it is for satiety. So chew slower and chew more, and satiety will increase. I couldn't really tell you by what percentage or anything like that, but the evidence seems to show that both of those, especially together, would be beneficial. Thirdly, talking about volume. It seems kind of self-explanatory, but I just thought I'd go ahead and throw it in here. But volume, the amount of food that you consume obviously has a pretty big impact. So if you're trying to, let's say for example, if you're trying to reduce your satiety, or let's say if we were to equalize the amount of satiety that a person has, one person is trying to gain weight, one person is trying to lose weight. Obviously the person who's trying to gain weight should try and consume within equal volume, consume foods that are higher in calories, while a person who's trying to lose weight should be trying to consume foods that are lower in calories, again with volume equated. And that volume is going to allow the body to then feel fuller longer. Okay, to wrap this up real quick, or for those who just want to skip the entirety of the video and just get a few quick highlights, satiety is the idea of being full or being satisfied from a nutritional standpoint. How it occurs, there are many different feedback mechanisms, moving from the mouth to the stomach to the intestines to the liver, blood glucose levels. We're talking about hormones, we're talking about all kinds of things, and those all kind of come together at a specific part of the brain called the hypothalamus, which can equally be impacted by its own hormones that are secreted specifically by fat cells, and those hormones are leptin and ghrelin. So those have an overpowering impact on satiety. Then moving on from that and understanding how to gain better satiety when eating, honestly just a few of the recommendations were increasing your protein amount, because protein has been shown to, on repeated occasions, to increase satiety. Even if you don't want to just eat protein, of course, you can pair that protein with other foods and you will get almost as good of a response from those, from that pairing. Also, eating a large amount of volume, so being aware of the caloric amount in each food, so that if you were to equate volume, just make sure, depending on your goals, to pay attention to the calories, but specifically focus on the amount of volume that you're allowed to eat. The more volume you have that you're allowed to eat, again, this is all relative to your goals, but the more volume you can eat, the better your satiety provides. Okay, well that's it. That's what I've got to say. That's what's in the video. And of course, if you'd like to know more details on everything that I have just discussed, as well as check out my sources, please check out the article that I have written with all my sources listed in APA. I believe this article's got something like 20 or 30 sources to substantiate everything that I've said. Please feel free to browse through it, read it, and let me know what you think. Hopefully it's helpful. Hopefully the video was helpful. The article is linked below, and as well as it will pop up on the screen momentarily. Have a good one. See you in the next one. Peace!